We don't applaud in between. We applaud in our hearts.
Good morning and welcome to the first webinar hosted by the research focus area Ancient Texts, Text, Context and Reception. As the name indicates, we busy ourselves with products of human culture from the ancient world. To be sure, ancient world and even ancient texts call to mind different things for different people. The millennials occupying our undergrad classrooms without any fear of contradiction would easily interpret our commonly used abbreviation BCE as meaning before computer era. So allow me a brief introduction stating what we are and what we do before two of our seasoned researchers give us a glimpse of the discoveries they are making in our research entity. That is our research entity, is conveniently linked to the Faculty of Theology here at the Northwest University. Although not as all-encompassing as suggested by some millennials, we do have a broader take on what qualifies as the ancient world and the artifacts we study that originated in that world. Usually a terminus a quo is not much in dispute, and we take that to be around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. When it comes to the terminus ad quem, as you will deduce from the talk by Professor Allen later today, we take the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 15th century as a convenient end date, rather than the more, and may we say, Eurocentric date for the fall of the Western Empire of the Roman Empire a whole millennium earlier. So beginning in the East then, we accommodate research related to Akkadian texts from the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE, and moving westwards we focus on the rich heritage of the Northwestern Semitic languages, and especially those linked to the origins of the Christian or the Judeo-Christian belief systems. A little further to the west, you will encounter another branch of our research that focuses on the Greek translations of these texts, also known as the Septuagint. The western border of our research endeavor is reached when studies of elegies and artifacts dating to the Roman Empire are discussed. Today, we will listen to Professor Nicholas Allen speaking on one of his research interests, an artifact that is commonly known as the Shroud of Turin. Beginning his scholarly career as an art historian, Prof. Allen has a broad research interest that lately includes a special interest in the work of Josephus. The other presenter, Professor Jaco Gericke, also combines more than one field of study in his research. Today he will explain to us the possibilities ancient texts, and specifically the Hebrew Bible, have in opening a door to what we may refer to as philosophical thought. For more information on our research and for access to the talks that are to follow today, please visit our faculty's Facebook page. First up then, Professor Nicholas Allen, to be followed by Professor Jaco Gericke without any further announcements. Start. Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to be speaking about my third edition of a book I've just recently produced, which deals specifically with the methods and techniques employed in creating the image on the so-called Shroud of Turin. And the book is entitled The Turin Shroud, Testament to a Lost Technology. And just for a little bit of background, for those of you who may not know what the Shroud of Turin is, this is a piece of cloth which measures about 4 meters long and about 1.2 meters wide. And we've known about this piece of cloth since at least 1350, which is right in the middle of the 14th century. And we're very lucky because a few years ago it was carbon dated, and we now know for a fact that this piece of cloth, the linen that was actually grown in the ground that became this cloth, was probably produced in Europe sometime in the late 13th century, maybe the early 14th century. So we have a very good idea of how old this is. However, it also happens to be one of the greatest relics of Christendom. To most Roman Catholics, this is considered to be the fifth gospel. Because if you look at the image, you can see that it contains the front and back view of a naked, crucified man, who it is believed is the actual historical Jesus. And what's very interesting about this image is that it shows a man with his arms crossed over his pelvic region. It shows the marks of the crown of thorns. It shows the marks of the nails, the wounds in the wrists and the feet, and it also shows the marks of the spear in the man's side. You'll also notice very unsightly marks on the cloth, which look a little bit like a train track, and that was caused by a fire in the 1360s where the cloth was nearly destroyed. It was folded up in a silver casket, and the fire burnt the edges of the cloth, and it was rescued, and then the patches were sewn into the holes, and that is why it looks the way it does today. If you were to look at the Shroud of Turin with a naked eye and go up close to it, you wouldn't be able to see the image. The image is almost invisible. But as you walk further and further away from the image, as you see in this particular slide, when you stand about 3 or 4 meters away from the image, you can see clearly the front and back view of a man. Now, in the 19th century, there was a photographer by the name of Secondo Pia who was given the job to photograph the shroud. And to his surprise, when he photographed the image, the negative photograph showed a positive image of the crucified man. And this was considered at the time to be so miraculous that the church considered it to be a forgery. Secondo Pia took another photograph and proved that it happens every time. So what this means is the Shroud of Turin, which dates from the late 13th century, is acting like a photographic negative. And you only know that it's a photograph when you take another photograph of it and produce a photographic positive.
If you look at the positive image of the Shroud of Turin, you can see far more details than what you can see on the negative image. And these details have only been available to modern man or human beings since the 19th century. If you look at the positive images from the Shroud of Turin, it's quite amazing to see such details as a broken nose, a torn beard, excoriations on the shoulder blades from carrying a heavy object, damage to the patella, the knees of the victim. In other words, details which are very, very specific and could only have been produced by some form of a photographic means. And yet, the cloth in the negative state doesn't show any of these details. If one wants to look at the image characteristics of the Shroud of Turin, which were discussed in 1978 by the Shroud of Turin Research Project, they came up with the following criteria. The image on the shroud is negative. It's highly detailed. It's directionless, which is very interesting to explain. If you have a painting, for example, you can tell the direction of the paintbrush marks by the artist. So if I was trying to forge a Leonardo da Vinci, however well I could do that, I would be caught out because my brushstrokes would not match the signature or the style of Leonardo da Vinci. The Shroud of Turin has no directionality whatsoever. In other words, there's no brush marks on the image. And when I talk about the image, I'm talking about the negative image of the man, not the positive image of the blood. Most amazingly of all is that there is no dye, pigment, or powder, or stain on this cloth. The image is made of what would be, I suppose, considered a scorch mark, or oxidation of the upper fibers of the cloth. Most amazing of all, if you take a photograph of the Shroud of Turin and you analyze it with a modern three-dimensional software, the computer can recreate the exact proportions of the dimensions of the man who was in the cloth. I might just add, you cannot do that with a modern photograph. The Shroud of Turin was involved in a major fire when it was based at Chambéry a few centuries ago, and the fire did not in any way affect the image. Water was poured over the cloth to put the fire out, and although there is a water stain on the cloth today, none of the image was affected. So we know that the cloth is also chemically stable. It's also heat resistant, and it has a slight toplit quality. In other words, if it was indeed a photograph, it was illuminated from the top of the head downwards, not from the side or from the bottom. And in the early 1980s, I became very interested in this artifact and decided that I would do some research on it. I was interested in finding out how it was made. And I had to think out of the box because the most obvious answer is that this must be made by some form of photography. But there's a problem. Photography was only invented in 1799, and this artifact dates back to the 1290s. So I had to find out what technology was available in the Middle Ages, and was it possible for them to have made something like a photograph in the Middle Ages? So I had to create a hypothesis, and what I'll do is in this image I'll show you what the hypothesis was, because you cannot make this image by direct contact. You can't make a print of a person with a piece of cloth because the cloth is two-dimensional and the person is three-dimensional, which means if you wrap the cloth around a three-dimensional body, you get distortion. The image on the shroud is almost perfect, which means that it can only have been created from a single direction, as in light, for example, reflecting off of an object. So the hypothesis was, perhaps they hung a corpse on a gibbet in the sun, and here is the sun, and here is the direction of the light from the sun illuminating the body. And perhaps they used a lens in the wall of a building or a camera obscura, and the light travels through the lens and is focused onto a screen which holds the shroud. And of course, the image would have been inverted and opposite to the image that created it. Looking at medieval technology, I was very pleased to discover very quickly that in fact all the ingredients that I needed to make a shroud were already there. For example, in the Middle Ages, they already had the camera obscura, they already had silver salts, and they already had lenses. And I created a lens made out of quartz in the exact fashion as was made in the Middle Ages. Another invention from the Middle Ages includes spectacles. This was in fact the age of optical technology and the invention of things like spectacles to improve eyesight. So it doesn't surprise one that an image like the shroud should have been made at this particular time in history. However, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I set up experiments, and my first experiments were with a small-scale camera obscura, which is basically a camera, a box camera, and my model was a plaster head. I then took a piece of linen and coated it in silver sulfate and allowed it to dry in a dark, cool place, placed the piece of linen inside the camera and exposed it through a quartz lens for 3 days. And after 3 days, this is what I achieved: a negative image of the plaster head. But the trouble, of course, now is if I took this piece of linen out of the camera, it would go brown because it's still got silver sulfate impregnated in its fabric. So we have to remove the silver sulfate to make it safe to bring out into the light of day. And to do that, one can use urine. You soak it in urine or dilute ammonia, and immediately you end up with this image. It's not as intense, it's very pale. You cannot see the image close up, but if you stand 3 or 4 meters away from the cloth, you're able to make out a negative image of a person's face. If you take a photograph of that negative image and look at the negative, which is now a positive, you get this image, which is exactly the same as the effect that one has on the Shroud of Turin. Having established that it was theoretically possible to make a photographic technique and reproduce the image using medieval technology, I decided then to take it a little bit further and make the entire shroud. This, of course, means that I've got to have a bigger camera. In this case, I used a whole building for my camera obscura. I had to make a cast of a human body for my corpse, and the corpse was allowed to hang up 4 meters from the lens. Inside the camera was stretched a piece of cloth impregnated with silver sulfate, and the light traveled through the crystal lens and focused on the screen using normal sunlight, reflected sunlight, and this is what the image looked like inside the camera. And as you can see, it's inverted. The corpse is upside down because it's gone through the lens. And you wait 3 days exactly, and when you switch off or you put on the lights, there you have the Shroud of Port Elizabeth. After this, I soaked it in urine to make it stable. I then turned the cloth around and exposed the back of the figure, and after another 3 days, I ended up with a complete shroud, front and back image. Now all one needs to do at this stage to make it like the Shroud of Turin is to take some blood and trickle it artistically in the right places on the cloth, and you can then recreate the Passion of Christ, however you feel like. just to show you what happens when you take a photograph of the Shroud of Port Elizabeth. This is what the image looks like when it's still in the negative. If you reverse the polarity and invert the image, this is what you get. You get a highly detailed three-dimensional image which shows details that are not visible when it is in the negative form, exactly like the Shroud of Turin. And here are some comparisons. That is the Shroud of Turin positive image, and that is the Shroud of Port Elizabeth positive image. The only difference between the two is the fact that my cloth has not been damaged in a fire, so I do not have railway tracks running up and down either side. And then based with that success, I went on to imperfect the process. Here are some examples of what I call Veronicas. These are images. In medieval time, it was believed that Saint Veronica went up to Christ on the way to Calvary and wiped her face with a cloth. And if you take a photograph of this cloth, you get a positive image, highly detailed. Again, details that are not visible with the negative image. And then more recently, in 2015, 2014, in Potchefstroom, we had a very interesting period here where CNN Science Channel came to Potchefstroom to do a documentary on the Shroud of Turin. And we made this image for CNN. And this is called the Veronica of Potchefstroom. And you can see it here in the negative form. And if I take a photograph of that or invert it, I end up with a positive image of the original subject. And so let me conclude by showing you a comparison between the Shroud of Turin and the Shroud of Potchefstroom. And if anybody wants any more information on this research, please feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jaco Gericke. I'm speaking with regard to the Old Testament and philosophy. Now, as you can see from my title, I've used the phrase Jerusalem and Athens. Now, many of you might not know what these cities refer to, but as will become clear in this short, brief presentation, I hope to show you that they have more in common in terms of what I mean by them than has been traditionally thought. As you can see from the subtitle, my interest is on the Old Testament and philosophy, and prima facie you will also think, but what do these two have to do with each other? And also, hopefully, in the presentation, I will show you that they have more in common than you might think, but not in the way you think. So, from the first slide, I've tried to use a few images that combines or expresses the ideas that I try to show by the use of illustrations to help you understand something that is difficult to communicate without background, but easy to understand once it's communicated in a certain way. So to start with, there are three questions or three themes this presentation will address. The first is with regard to the images of Jerusalem and Athens. The second is, what do we mean by philosophy? If we are going to relate the Old Testament to philosophy, what do we mean? And thirdly, what are the ways or where can we find philosophy in relation to both the Old Testament and research on the Old Testament? So, with regard to Jerusalem and Athens, now the original context, or shall I say one of the original context for the phrase that if you have some theological background, you'll know it associated with one of the North African church fathers, Tertullian, the 2nd century, you can say scholar or Christian, who wondered, or what would philosophy have in common with Christianity in particular. Now, he asked the question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? However, the original context in which this appears is on his treatise against the heretics, and it refers to a very specific philosophical context. Now, the way I'm going to use it is not about the context that Tertullian used it initially. I'm going to explain that context a bit, but I'm going to use it as a general example of a tension between the biblical text, specifically the Old Testament, on the one hand, and philosophy on the other. Now, in Tertullian's treatise, or his tirade, or his writings against the heretics, he was addressing a certain opponent, polemically arguing that there is no need for an interest in the philosophy of the time. There were many Christians at the time who took an interest specifically with reference to the New Testament and Jesus, and they would ask very critical questions, speculating about problems that historical critics with centuries or later have more focus on in their studies. But in Tertullian's context, there were already Greeks and others, and specifically those philosophically inclined at the time, who looked at the Gospels and many of the New Testament texts and had all these philosophical questions, which Tertullian found no need for. Now, in the context of the quote of what has Athens, standing for philosophy, to do with Jerusalem, standing for the Bible, or the context of that, in there he is referring to certain specific types of Greek philosophy. Now, in generally, the Greeks or Greek philosophy is stereotyped with a very critical speculative mindset. And Tertullian was referring to specifically both Paul's reference in Acts to the Athenians, who are always curious, always asking questions, and in his warning in the Colossians to not be spoiled by philosophy. Now, in the historical context in which Tertullian used the question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? The specific examples he gives of philosophical inquiry that is not necessary once one is a Christian are very specific, and they all have to do with certain Neoplatonist, Stoicist, and other philosophies that couldn't be reconciled with his view of the Christian gospel. That does not mean he had no use for philosophy, because even Tertullian, if you study his works, had himself used certain Stoic, certain Platonist and other ideas, but only very selectively, according to which you can accommodate to his theology. Now, over the centuries of biblical interpretation, specifically with reference to the Old Testament, an issue in the philosophy of religion called the relationship between faith and reason has plagued the study of what these ancient texts mean. In other words, in the course of the centuries that people have read the Old Testament, as Christians call it, or the Hebrew Bible, as biblical scholars, or with specific reference to Jewish scholars, would also call it the Tanakh, they had a problem with certain philosophies. Not all the time, but usually when some biblical interpreters, whether Jewish or Christian, try to reconcile the biblical context and contents with certain philosophers that were in vogue at the time, like Plato or Aristotle. Again, they were always used for these philosophers' ideas, but once certain interpreters of the Bible within the church had certain views where they privileged the philosopher above the biblical text, and they tried to harmonize the Bible to the philosopher too much so that it clashed with church dogma, this was a problem. Now, what happened throughout the centuries of Old Testament interpretation which was not specialized at the time, but part of general biblical interpretation within Christianity, what happened was there was a tension between the Old Testament, or what you would call ancient Israelite religion, and on the one hand, and philosophy on the other. Now, this tension has been verbalized in many different ways. Some would call it the tension between the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of the philosophers, meaning that the way God is perceived in biblical theology or biblically based theologies are seen as in conflict with those of philosophical abstract ideas of God. Now, what you find in later forms of this, what you might call a binary opposition or opposites, is a clash between biblical and natural or philosophical theology, the same clash that there has been since the modern times between Old Testament studies, sometimes in systematic theology, or various forms of what you would call historical interpretation and philosophical readings, which culminated in the 20th century in certain oppositions to the use of philosophy in the interpretation of the Old Testament. Now, the specialization within the Old Testament and philosophy is rather modern, and we are not going into that now. But what we want to know is what do we want from philosophy and what do we mean by it? Because if we understand what we mean, we understand why it was a problem or should not be a problem. Now, what do we mean by philosophy? Now, what you would call it, the etymological meaning or the root of the word philosophy comes from the Greek phileo, the verb, to love, one of the words for love, and sophia, wisdom. So rather ordinary, it just means the love of wisdom. But this is only a reference in certain ancient Greek texts to philosophy, and most philosophers did not refer to themselves in the Greek text as philosophers. And what was understood by wisdom also has a history. Wisdom goes back to mantic wisdom or ideas associated with magic and various forms of astrology and craftsmanship, right through to interpretation of dreams, interpretation of the weather, interpretation of various omens. Now, what we see then is with philosophy, there is no one thing philosophy means. You can't argue from the root of a word originally to what it currently means or has meant when it's actually practiced. Now, in the history of philosophy, there is no one single thing, one single problem philosophers have worried about, and there is no single thing philosophy has been. Stereotypically, or for convenience sake, one can say that philosophy nowadays is concerned with what you might call the way people think about what reality is and what its nature is. And this is really oversimplifying. What do we mean by knowledge and what it's about, morality, and also the way we reason. Of course, there are many branches in philosophy, many different forms of philosophy, many schools, many different traditions, many of which do not accept some of the subdisciplines, for example, not being metaphysical at all, others understanding knowledge in a completely different way or not thinking of it in any traditional terms. So this is really, again, an oversimplification. But what do I mean by philosophy when I say how do the Old Testament and Old Testament scholarship relate to philosophy? When I try to discuss this, there's usually a problem, because traditionally philosophy is not always at ease with the Old Testament and vice versa. Now, if you're a biblical scholar coming from this side, you will know from the history of Old Testament interpretation that there are many often valid reasons why biblical scholars have been wary of philosophy, especially in the modern times. Looking back, easy to criticize in retrospect, because in hindsight you have more, the ability to judge, but nowadays, since the rise of historical consciousness in the modern world, biblical scholars no longer really consider themselves as practicing an allegorical form of biblical interpretation. And usually the ancient philosophical readings have been associated with allegorical readings of the text, where the text says something, but it actually has this deeper spiritual meaning, totally unrelated to what it appears to say. But this is not the only way philosophy has been seen as problematic. in the history of biblical interpretation, especially in the modern world, other forms of philosophical readings have fallen into disrepute. These include modern attempts to reconcile again the history of Israelite religion, say for example with Hegelian philosophy or some form of systematic treatment of biblical epistemology with Kant's version of what it means to know something, the world of phenomena or appearances, and what reality is in itself. And even later attempts. It seems to be that in Old Testament studies in general, for most of the 20th century, if you could say, this is the person's philosophical assumptions, or they are using this philosophical grid or category or concept, it simply invalidates their work, because the Old Testament is not supposed to be reconcilable to philosophy. Why not? Because chronologically, it seems that the time to which many of the biblical stories refer are not the time that philosophy emerged. For example, philosophy is associated with the 6th century BCE, while the Old Testament is usually associated with stories referring to events of the pre-exilic era or before that, even though historically that is not technically so easy to judge. Also, with regard to other variables, if one thinks of the cultures, people associate philosophy with the Greeks, and while the Old Testament is usually associated with the ancient Near East in modern study. Then with regard as well to other variables like the contents of philosophy, and also the forms and the language and the methodology used is usually not associated with what either the Old Testament authors or Old Testament scholars do, which means people who mix philosophy in the Old Testament are seen as not quite able to sense what fits what, and are attempting to combine or merge apples and oranges, if I may use that phrase. Now, where can philosophy be found in Old Testament studies or in relation to the Old Testament? Now, this is a difficult question, but in recent times it has become once again relevant after, for most of the 20th century, I've seen the question is basically forbidden unless it's used to criticize somebody else's views. Now, I want to explain how I see philosophy in relation to the Old Testament, or its possibilities in relation to the Old Testament, with reference to the philosopher Paul Ricoeur's hermeneutical philosophy, where he distinguished between 3 different worlds. The one is the world behind the text, which basically refers to the world in which the biblical texts were written. However one thinks of that, however one reconstructs it, it's the time or place in which the texts were produced by scribes or whoever else. Then the world of the text refers to the world within the text, that when you read the biblical stories, that world in which things happen, where the characters act and so on. That is what Paul Ricoeur, or what an application of his philosophy would say is the world of the text. Whereas the world in front of the text is the world ever since the biblical texts were written, or in this case the Old Testament, how it has been interpreted since it has been written. And I'm going to show where I see philosophy in relation to each of these worlds. Now, first of all, one of the ways in which I see philosophy is that I don't think one can say the Old Testament is a philosophical textbook. But it doesn't follow from that there are no philosophical assumptions. All language, even the biblical text, have philosophical assumptions in the sense that they have assumptions about the nature of reality, knowledge, morality, and reasoning. And they also have problems and perspectives on those issues, not always put in philosophical terms and not always in a philosophical genre that you might associate with philosophy stereotypically. But these things are implicit, and unless we describe it as part of the worldview of the text, we have not understand what the Old Testament assumes about the nature of reality, which is not metaphysics, but it's metaphysical assumptions. What they assume about the nature of knowledge, which is not epistemology, but epistemological assumptions. So there you see the first point with regard to the presuppositions, problems, and perspectives that must be present for the Old Testament to be dealing with the kind of things it deals, even as literature and even if it was not intended for that purpose, but only incidentally, have these philosophical assumptions present, as we all do in our language. Secondly, what you can do is there are parts of the Old Testament worldview that are philosophical in nature, or worldviews. If you look at the text, the world of the text, or the world behind the text, those who wrote the text, they had worldviews, whether they were cognizant of this or that or not. And some parts of those worldviews are comprised by components, assumptions about things that exist, or what they are like, how do you know about them, and how do you relate to them. And these are philosophical assumptions, and I call them philosophical assumptions because they relate to philosophical topics, which implies that they are perspectives on that, even though they are not articulated. And clarifying those parts of biblical worldviews, or any ancient worldviews, is in a sense a philosophical approach dealing with philosophical material, even if it's historical and ends with a descriptive task. Thirdly, identifying assumptions implicit in the language of the Old Testament related to philosophical text. Again, this is related to the first two and partly already addressed. So I'm going to go on to the next one, looking at the Old Testament from the perspective of a particular philosophical discipline or topic. In this case, what you would do is you would think of any philosophical discipline like the philosophy of religion or aesthetics or philosophy of literature, and you would look at some topic or theme therein, and then you can see. But if somebody from the discipline were to look at the Old Testament, what do they see? And you can obviously, with a bit more biblical scholarship as background, see what is more hermeneutically or exegetically legitimate, or in terms of anachronistic concepts, concerns, and categories. But you can still ask, given that these are the issues of interest in this discipline, does, if anything, this or that Old Testament text assume or imply anything in relation thereto, irrespective of whether you want to take the view as normative or just out of historical interest. Either way, it's still a valid question. Fifth, one can do comparative philosophy. In this sense, what you are doing with references to the world of the text and the world in front is what biblical theologians have done without saying so many words. When Old Testament theologians have said, well, here Hebrew and Greek thought are very different, and this is how the Old Testament view of any specific view about the deity or moral concept like justice is very different from Greek philosophy. The only way they could do so is first use this concept from Greek philosophy, for example, seeing Yahweh as an entity with a nature, with attributes, or thinking of biblical ethics and discussing concepts like goodness or justice, which are pretty abstract. Looking at the philosophical term, then comparing it to what the Old Testament says or implies in this text, how many different implications there are in different texts, and then seeing that it differs or it doesn't say anything about it or has a very different view of it, or even a similar view, but on this point or that point it may lead into another direction. So when one tries to say that the Old Testament, or Hebrew thought as it's popularly called, is so different from Greek philosophy, you can only do so by first comparing the two, using Greek philosophical frameworks as the point of orientation, and then restate what the Hebrew thought means in relation to Greek terms, not in order to harmonize it, but to clarify it and to say, okay, this is how it agrees, this is how it differs, or this is just simply what it means if put into the philosophical language. And these are the limitations or pros and cons of doing so, also admitted. So one can't really avoid it. 6, looking at philosophical presuppositions, problems, and perspectives that have influenced the history of our interpretation. Now, even if you think there is no philosophical content related to the world behind or in the text, of the text, you still have to deal with the fact that the history of interpretation of the Old Testament as readers who themselves have philosophical assumptions, and that every question in research has been influenced by what was philosophically popular. You might think, for example, that discussions of literary criticism and metaphor and poetry is a modern thing, but many of these things go back to Aristotle, and they go back to a time when philosophy didn't distinguish between certain forms of inquiry, and when science just was natural philosophy, and Aristotle's rhetorics and poetics did a lot of stuff that we are now concerned with when we do literary criticism. And the same with historical criticism or social scientific criticism. If you look at the history of these disciplines or any other form of exegesis, you will see that a lot of the theoretical frameworks components has roots in ancient philosophical and exegetical enterprises. Of course, to a large extent, this has been adapted and applied selectively given what we know works and don't, or think we know works and don't. But this is another form of research that you can literally be focused on reception history and see how philosophy has supervened or influenced the way we perceive not only the Old Testament, but the kinds of problems and perspectives people have been interested in or have been popular. Whether you just want to judge or criticize it or go along with it or just describe it, it's up to you, but it's still philosophical, even if it's historical. Then point 7, offering a philosophical clarification of concepts popularly used in Old Testament theology. The Old Testament has a lot of concepts or terms that are only implicit, but there is no words in Old Testament Hebrew like reality or existence or nature or attributes with reference to the deity. So when Old Testament theologians speak in these terms in the second order language, they use concepts from philosophy. Now what you can do is, even if you don't want to read the Bible philosophically, you can still, with some philosophical background or interest, analyze the philosophical content of those concepts within Old Testament theology, whether to criticize or simply to clarify or to expand on it. So it doesn't have to be one way or another. And last but not least, discussing the influence of the use of the Old Testament within philosophy. In other words, not in the history of biblical interpretation, but the way the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, has functioned, whether directly or indirectly, in the way philosophers, whether Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, from the early times, from the beginning of the Common Era, right through to the modern times, to this day, there are allusions, concepts, motives, and other things that if you trace their history, of course you can go back to the Near East, but they also have Old Testament counterparts. And this has not been mapped, it has not been discussed, because the interdisciplinary work that relates the Old Testament to philosophy is rare because of past bad experiences when doing so. In conclusion then, philosophy in the Old Testament have had a turbulent history of interaction. However, there are many ways of involving philosophy in the study that run the risk of committing hermeneutical and exegetical fallacies, which is good reasons why certain forms of philosophical interpretations can no longer be followed, because they have been shown not to be in line with the latest hermeneutical and exegetical theoretical frameworks. However, that does not follow that nothing is possible anymore and that there's no philosophical work possible or useful. Nowadays, there's a return of philosophy, but not in the old ways of allegorical readings or trying to systematize it or harmonize it with this or that philosopher, but in other forms as I've described. And to end the presentation, this allows us to facilitate research where it's not so much about Old Testament philosophy, but new philosophical approaches to the Old Testament, its text, its context, and its reception. Thank you.